The M4 Sherman, 30 tons of American steel, a Continental R-975 gasoline engine, 75 millimeters of main armament, and a crew of 5 men who spent more time inside that iron box than in their own beds. I commanded a tank from November of '43 through May of '45, fought my way from the shores of Italy to the very heart of Germany. And by the time the war ended, I knew every bolt and every weakness of that machine as well as I knew my own hands. I'll start with a truth not everyone likes to hear. The Sherman was not the best tank of the war. German Tigers and Panthers outclassed it in armor and firepower. The Soviet T-34 was simpler to manufacture and better suited to Russian mud. But the Sherman was ours, and we learned to live with it, work with it, and fight in it. And in the end, that's what matters most. The first thing you understand when you climb into a Sherman is the tightness. 5 men in a hull that looks large from the outside and turns out, on the inside, to be packed so full of machinery, ammunition, radio equipment, and human bodies that you can only turn around if everyone else decides not to move at the same moment. My gunner, Petrowski, a Pole from Chicago, broad-shouldered as a wardrobe, managed to catch me in the helmet with his elbow every single time he got in. We argued about whose fault it was back in '43 and never did settle the question. The engine sat in the rear, and that had consequences. The Continental R-975 was an aircraft engine adapted for ground use, powerful, reasonably reliable, but thirsty beyond all reason and sensitive to dust. In Italy, where the roads were coated in chalky powder, the air filters clogged faster than we could clean them. Our driver-mechanic, Jim Harris, cleaned the filters every 2 hours on the march and managed, while doing so, to swear with such conviction that even Italian farmers who didn't know a word of English understood perfectly well what he thought of the designers. The Sherman's operational range was around 160 kilometers on road. Cross-country, considerably less. This meant a constant dependence on fuel trucks that followed behind us and made themselves targets for German aircraft and artillery. I remember one march in December of '44 during the Ardennes offensive when we stopped dead in the middle of the road with empty tanks 3 kilometers from German positions and waited 4 hours for a fuel truck to arrive, praying that enemy reconnaissance wouldn't spot a column of 12 stationary tanks. The fuel truck came. We were alive. That counted as luck. The main weakness of the Sherman, which everyone talked about, was the armor. The frontal plate on the basic model ran to about 51 millimeters, and the German 88 millimeter gun punched through it at distances from which we couldn't yet answer effectively. The Panther, with its long-barreled .75, did the same. Crews understood this and developed their own doctrine: never expose the flank, stay in formation, use the folds in the ground. But there was one problem worse than penetration. The Sherman burned. The Germans called it the Tommy Cooker. Our own soldiers called it the Ronson, after the lighter whose advertising slogan was "Lights first time, every time." The reason was the fuel and the placement of the ammunition. Early models stored shells in sponsons along the sides, and when they were hit, they detonated with results I would prefer not to describe in detail. Later, with the M4A3, the ammunition was moved to protected wet stowage in the floor of the hull, and the situation improved. Our second Sherman, we lost the first one at Monte Cassino, was exactly that variant. And that is possibly why I am here telling this story at all. We lost the first tank in February of '44. A German Pak 40 anti-tank gun firing from a concealed position our reconnaissance had missed. The first shell hit the right flank. The second caught the engine compartment. We had roughly 20 seconds to get out. All 5 of us got out. Our loader, Thomas, took a burn to his right hand. The rest of us came away with bruises and concussion. We lay in a ditch by the roadside and watched the machine we lived in for the last 3 months burn. Petrowski said, "Shame about the thermos. It was a good thermos. German. We'd taken it off someone. The tracks were their own subject. The Sherman ran on rubber-padded steel cleats, which was fine for roads and poor for everything else. In mud, it slid. In snow, even more so. In the winter of '44 to '45, as we pushed into Germany, mechanics welded homemade spikes out of scrap metal onto the tracks, and sometimes stripped tracks from knocked-out German vehicles and bolted them to their own for added grip. This was technically prohibited and universally practiced. The HVSS suspension, horizontal volute spring system, fitted to the later models, improved the ride and the cross-country performance considerably. The difference between the old vertical suspension and the new one was roughly the difference between a wagon and an automobile. The gunner missed less often on the move, the driver tired less quickly, and the headaches arrived at a different intensity, which also mattered during marches that lasted many hours. The M3 75mm gun was adequate against most German armor in '43 and '44. Against a Tiger head-on, no. Against the Tiger's flank at close range, yes, if the angle cooperated. We had the penetration tables memorized and built our tactics around those numbers. A Tiger had to be flanked, made to turn, hit in the rear or the side. That required coordination and nerve, and it did not always work out, and when it didn't, someone paid the highest price for the error. When Shermans fitted with the 76mm M1 gun began reaching the units, the mood in the formations shifted noticeably. The M1 could penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at normal combat ranges. It didn't solve every problem, but it was a fundamentally different feeling, knowing you had a weapon capable of answering what was trying to kill you. The SCR-508 radio set was, without exaggeration, one of the main advantages of American armored forces. Early in the war, the Germans coordinated with flags and hand signals. We talked by voice, between vehicles, between platoons, between companies. That meant the ability to react quickly, to shift positions, to report threats before those threats could fully materialize. I remember a fight outside Aachen in October of '44, when the radio saved us as surely as the armor ever did. The lead tank in our platoon was ambushed in a narrow alley. The commander, Lieutenant Davis, managed to get on the air and call out his reference points before they silenced him. We turned around, went around the block, hit from the flank. Davis lost his tank, but his crew survived, and the German anti-tank gun was destroyed. Without the radio, we would simply have driven down the same alley and repeated his fate. Maintenance was a daily ritual. After every march, after every engagement, check the running gear, check the engine, oil levels, filter condition, ammunition load, integrity of the optics. The crew did this without being ordered to, because they understood. A machine that isn't looked after is a machine that will fail at the worst possible moment. Harris could tell by sound alone whether the engine was running right. Petrowski could feel through the sight whether the elevation mechanism on the gun was properly adjusted. It was a living organism, 5 men and 30 tons of steel, and when it functioned as it should, there was nothing more dependable in the world. In April of '45, already in Germany, we halted before a small town in Bavaria. The war was nearly over. Everyone understood that, and it was precisely for that reason that the last battles were especially terrible, dying when weeks remained until the end seemed a particular kind of injustice. Our platoon was given the assignment to clear the northern edge of town. We passed through an orchard, came out onto a street, and took a Panzerfaust round in the left flank. The grenade didn't fully penetrate. It struck at the wrong angle, but the explosion knocked out the left side running gear and concussed Harris. The tank stopped. We sat there for 2 hours while the infantry came up and secured a perimeter, while the M32 recovery vehicle arrived and the crew began replacing the tracks. Harris sat on the rear deck and looked up at the Bavarian sky and said he could hear a ringing in his ears, and that the ringing reminded him of church bells in Cleveland, where he was from. Petrowski poured him coffee from the new thermos, not a German one this time, an American one, government issue, and said that bells meant good luck. The war ended 3 weeks later. Harris went back to Cleveland. Petrowski went back to Chicago. I went back to Detroit, and for a long time dreamed about the engine compartment and heard in my sleep the sound of the Continental R-975 at idle. The Sherman was not the best tank of the war, but it was our tank, and we drove it where it needed to go, and we brought home most of the men who rode inside it. For a machine they called a tin can and a lighter, that's not nothing.